Well, with me today is Martha Tartarnic. She is an Anglican priest in St. Catherine's, which is in the Niagara region of Ontario. She leads the busy downtown congregation of St. George. How long have you been there?
I've been here for 8 years.
For 8 years.
Yes.
And we will be talking together with her second book, which is called Why Gather? The Hope and Promise of the Church, which has just been published. She's also authored The Living Diet, which is a Christian's journey of joyful eating, this exploration of our relationship with food and our bodies, all through a Christian perspective. Martha's married to Dan, and they are the parents of 2 teenagers, and they are the overseers of 2 funny dogs. Martha enjoys long distance running, which shows up in the book.
Yes.
Singing, which shows up in the book, and deep fellowship with friends, which also shows up in the book. Martha, I know that you're busy, but thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to join me today.
Oh, it is such a privilege, and thank you for inviting me.
No worries. And thank you for sending me your book. It's really, really good. I've really enjoyed reading it. And as I talked to you when I invited you, this is the stuff that I love to geek out over, kind of what the church is and what the church could be and all this kind of stuff. And so I love that you accepted my invitation to geek out together.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of geeking out together. You could add that to the list of things that I enjoy.
Wonderful.
Geeking out.
So why don't you just describe, like, where did it come from? Why did you write Why Gather?
Yeah, I would say that there were kind of 3 converging threads that kind of ultimately led to the writing of this book. So the one piece is, having served for my entire life, lived and served for my entire life in an institution that is in precipitous decline.
Sure.
And that narrative of decline being, such a feature of what it is to serve in the church right now. So that's kind of one thread. Connected very intimately to that thread is finding myself on the edge of burnout a couple of years ago, which, I could point to like a lot of specific reasons why maybe I was feeling so depleted, but ultimately, I think the more general reason is just getting so weighed down by the expectations that get placed on leadership.
Sure.
In terms of addressing that decline. And then the third piece was all of this was kind of unfolding just as we realized we were in a global pandemic.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of questions got laid bare by COVID as we kind of saw our world fall apart and saw just how many people, COVID aside, were really being left behind in the society that we're creating together. I just found myself asking, like, what does the church have to offer this world? Suddenly when we can't gather in the way that we are used to gathering, does it even matter that we try to gather? Like, what is this about? And our own survival didn't seem like a very compelling answer. My own survival didn't seem like a very compelling answer. Like, I didn't want to continue to serve in the church just to get by.
Keep the lights on. Yeah.
So those were the converging threads that led to my asking those questions and ultimately writing the book.
Sure. I've always thought there is something really, I don't know, divine. I don't know if it's divinely comical or divinely, intriguing of, within our denomination, we had this great, huge report that landed on everybody that said, 2040 and you're done, right? And then this pandemic happens where everything shuts down,
like
and
months later.
We're like months later,
yeah,
where we're faced with this almost as this visceral reality of, okay, so what does it look like if you actually can't go to the building, right? And there's something there that I think is a little bit was a little bit of a wake up, I think.
Yeah, I think a wake up. And I think that so much of our efforts around like programmatic change and, if you do this, then like numerical growth will happen. And like kind of all of the different buzzwords that have gone around and buzz programs that have gone around. Like so many of them we latch onto and throw ourselves into without asking that more fundamental question, like, does any of this even matter?
Sure.
And I just feel like with that shutdown, we had to be really honest, and we had to ask those deeper questions, not just as a church. Like you look at all of the deeper questions that got raised up in COVID. Like we had to be really honest about who we are as a people and what kind of world we want to create. And the church has to be really honest about whether we have anything to contribute to the kind of world that we want to create, beyond just, like you said, keeping the lights on.
Absolutely. So one of the things that you write about is people requesting, please don't give us a hypotheoretical vision of what the church could be. And so how is Why Gather? How is your book different than just this next iteration of do this and you will win?
Yeah. Well, I try to be really clear that this is not a book to save the church. And that maybe that's not our job. I'm pretty convinced that's not our job. So I'm not interested in hypothetical visions of what the church can be. What I do talk about in the book is ultra realism. And that is a term that comes from long distance running. It's a mental shift that you make as a runner when you're, starting to a 30-kilometer run and it's raining and like I'm pretty sure I have to pee even though I just went, and I'm only a kilometer in and there's 29 to go. It's easy to get like really wound up in what might be coming, or what I'm worried might be coming, or what I wish were different. And ultra realism is about seeing, accepting, and embracing what's really happening. Well, I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to say like there is analogy there, not just for the church, but for life, right? Like how much of our lives, let alone how much of our lives in the church, do we spend kind of worrying about what might be around the corner, or wishing that things were different. And so I got really interested in seeing what is actually happening, and accepting that and embracing that. And, to say that we see, accept, and embrace what's actually happening isn't to say that like we're anti-change, or, that we're just stuck, because, again, whether you're a writer or a runner or a human being or a member of the church, change is inevitable. But it's good to make changes based on what is actually happening rather than on wishing or worrying.
Yeah. So, because you write a lot about that ultra realism, and I'm not a runner, so I found that kind of fascinating. And you set up your book around seeing, accepting, and embracing. Out of those three, is there one that you think is harder? Is the hurdle to get over? Is our problem that we don't see, or that we're not embracing, or?
I don't know. What is our problem? Yeah, like maybe the biggest piece is the seeing, because I think that that's actually what we're called to do as Christians. Like, if we look at Jesus' inaugural words when he steps out and begins his public ministry, he begins with the words, repent, the kingdom of God is drawing near. Well, we have all kinds of hangups around what the word repent means, and like it's about guilt and it's about sin and all of that kind of thing. It really just means to turn around. And what I hear in the turning around is like, look again. Like,
okay, yeah,
it's already happening. Like,
yeah,
the kingdom of God is already drawing near. Like, you don't have to make that happen. You don't have to get your lives in order and then it will happen. You don't have to manage it into happening. You have to get better at seeing that it is happening. And then we can give our time and attention and love and energy to that.
absolutely.
Like, it's actually a very freeing inaugural message that I think frames Jesus' entire ministry.
Yeah.
And so if you don't have the seeing part, it's so easy to get locked into thinking like
Sure.
the building of the kingdom all rests on our shoulders.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. And it is quite a radical thing. I remember a seminary professor talking about, the terms that we commonly translate as behold, right? Which we see as very just kind of austere and polite and behold, and then what she did was she grabbed her Bible and slammed it on the desk and screamed, look at this, or listen to this. Like, it's this visceral call to see what is actually going on. Not this polite religious term that we've kind of made it out to be.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, it's beautiful.
So the other thing that I really love about your Why Gather, and it's not this hypocritical vision, because I've read a lot of stuff about the church, and it very much is, here's the, and some, not saying that they're bad, but here are the theological concepts, here's the theoretical concepts, this is what you do, this is all the backing, this is the research, blah, 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 blah. And you have that. But it's all wrapped up in stories. Why is entering the story of the church, the big C church, but also the small C church, our local parish, why is entering and embracing the story important?
I guess I would say very simply that that's all the church is. Like,
okay, yeah.
Like, it's just the stories of like a bunch of messed up people who have found themselves like gathered together and met by the surprising power of God. Like, that's kind of it. Like, like, obviously there's a lot of stuff we put around that, and there's a lot of tradition and ritual and institutional stuff that can serve that. Like, it's not all bad by any means. It can all serve that, but at the end of the day, that's sort of what it is. So yeah, and that's who I am. Like, I'm a priest, and I say in the book, and I say it regularly in my life, just to try to remind myself of what I'm actually about. Like, my job description is very simple. Like, my job description is to lift up those stories. Like, my job description is to lift up the bread and wine at the Eucharistic table week in and week out. But when I'm doing that lifting up, I'm lifting up the offering of the stories of our lives and believing that, like, God is doing something holy and blessed with our lives, and God is, like, that promise is clear.
Sure, absolutely. And is that, like, you have this wonderful picture where you talk about, I am a priest and this is what I'm doing. And is that, and I guess, that's not just the call for us who wear the collars, right? For the priests, it's the call for everyone, laity included, to enter in and lift up their own stories, but also maybe to lift up other people's stories as well.
Yeah, well, and that's why we talk about the priesthood of all believers. And I think regardless of which order of the church you're talking about, ultimately, whatever our ordered ministry is for, it is to equip that ministry of the entire body of Christ,
Sure.
right? So I am the one at the Eucharistic table lifting up that bread and wine, but I'm doing that as a reminder, as you say, to how we're all supposed to be
Sure.
lifting up our lives and lifting up one another's lives, to be met by the blessing of God. We could talk about the other orders as well, but it's not like anybody has sole responsibility of the lifting up.
Sure.
Or the lives of service, or the lives of pastoral care, or whatever you want to talk about it. Like, we're shared in we share in it together.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. And those stories that we lift up are messy.
Yeah.
Right? And you confront that, right? That, this is it Bob that you talk about, as a Bob you talk about,
Yeah,
and then you say, but Bob's not perfect.
Yeah.
This isn't, part of seeing is recognizing the messiness of our communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think that fairy tale endings are hard to come by. I think that, even when we experience miracle, and we do, like, there's stories of miracle in the book as well. Miracle doesn't override death. Sure. It doesn't override suffering. It doesn't override sin. All of those pieces of brokenness and fragility are still very much part of the story as well. And I think that getting ultra real is being really clear about the brokenness as well as the holiness.
Sure. Yeah. Why do you think we take the instances of brokenness and death and mess? Why do we allow those, or do we allow those to override the grander vision of God's kingdom? Like, so often I hear from people who say, I'm struggling with the church, or even struggling with faith. And so I'm going to take some time out of the church. And when I figure it all out, then I'll come back. As if this church is the place that's supposed to have it all figured out, and the place where we go when we have it all figured out. And often what happens is I never see them again. Right. So why do we allow these places of discouragement or death or frustration or mess to jettison us from the gathering?
I mean, there are probably different reasons for that. And, I would have to speak mostly from my own context as having spent most of my life in the Anglican Church. Like, there is something about our Anglican culture that is predominantly very polite. And just like, there are certain things that we'd rather not speak about or hear about. And, some of that is our brokenness. Some of it is about our relationship with God. I mean, I see that culture really changing a lot. And I don't like speaking about Anglican culture in blanket terms, but like, I have a lot of experience of that very polite Anglicanism. We also do put so much stock in the beauty of our worship that I think it's easy for people to feel like if they don't feel beautiful, then maybe they don't fit. I think that there's lots of room for shifting that culture and for making room for a lot more honesty. And I think that is changing.
Sure.
But those would be kind of my observations about what has been true in large swaths of our church.
Yeah. Yeah. Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Life Together talks about how in order to fully enter a community, he calls it the wish dream, like the dream of the church, of this perfect community, that it needs to die. Because if that's what you think that you're always working towards, you're never actually going to enter into the community that is.
Yeah. And that's the hypothetical vision of the
Yeah,
church
absolutely.
that like we can just never quite get to. So it always feels like we're reaching.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's also, in terms, we can't save the church, as you said, but I think there is, it is incumbent upon the leaders, I would say, to recognize and to model the sense of vulnerability within the community and the mess. Like, in your book, you talked about, hey, I was hitting burnout and I wasn't, managing things well. And I know in my own life here at the church, when we were going through a really, really hard time, it was very easy for me to, when people said, "Oh, Kyle, how are you doing?" "Oh, I'm fine. I'm managing quite well." But community happened when I started saying, actually, could you help me with this? Because I'm not doing this and I can't do it. When I actually started being real about some of the things that some of the balls that I was dropping, right? And in this juggling of things, that's actually when community actually started to really fully take place.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely right. I mean, I think in my life as a priest, I have noted that, my leadership style isn't for everyone. That sometimes that level of self-disclosure and being pretty honest about some of my own struggles, but that can make people uncomfortable. I mean, there is something like really appealing about thinking, like having pedestals to place people on and thinking that, we have heroes. We have kind of a visceral need for heroes. And I think that my leadership style has at times not been everybody's cup of tea, but I'm pretty committed to that leadership style nonetheless, because I do think like that is our Christian journey. And I think that if we're not modeling it in a pretty honest way, within professional
of course,
reason,
exactly.
But if we're not modeling that in a pretty intentional way, then what are we doing?
Sure.
Like if we are presenting ourselves as just like these people from on high who have it all figured out and are just kind of like pointing our fingers at people and telling them what they should do, like that that's not real.
Well, and even within a congregation, you don't need to disclose your heart's hurt to everybody in the congregation, and to the newcomer that comes in, like there is boundaries and personal boundaries that you set up for your own spiritual and psychological and emotional health, right? And so that's part and parts of it. But if you're not being true to kind of what you're experiencing and how you're living and how you're feeling to people who you have gathered around you to support you and to lift you up, then I just think you're missing on something so important within the life of the community.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, it is pretty hard for me anyway to talk about my most profound spiritual experiences without also talking about how I've been broken.
Sure.
Like God meets me in my mess too.
Yep.
So yeah, again, like definitely professional boundaries and like you don't want it to all be about you, but but within reason, there needs to be some willingness to walk the same path we're
Yeah.
asking others to walk.
Well, and yes, exactly. And again, that goes back to that, messiness. I think it's chapter 4 where you open up about criticisms that
Mm,
you have experienced. And I think everybody probably, and everybody in leadership and probably everybody in the church has a sense of being criticized, or maybe, and probably being the one who criticizes and all that kind of stuff. And I like that so you have a very honest picture of the church, which doesn't blanket over those things. Because again, sometimes we can look at that and say, oh, well, this isn't a Christian community, so I'll go find some place where there's no criticisms.
yeah.
Okay, good luck with that.
Good luck.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think Charles Spurgeon once received a letter from someone that said, "Can you help me find the perfect church?" And he responded by saying, "If you find it, do not join it, because you will ruin it." but there was a sense that, it's not going to, we're all flawed people. We're all sinners in need of grace. And we all need forgiveness, and we all need to extend forgiveness to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. A term I've been thinking about a lot lately is validate. And
Sure.
And like, that's a term that's very wrapped up in both acceptance and change. And, when I kind of can pause and think about where criticism is coming from, I can recognize that there's a whole world of hurt that has nothing to do with me, that is layered into the things that people find disappointing about me or the church, or what have you,
or the internal turmoil that they're struggling with.
Yeah, exactly. And so while I can certainly name my own pain in being kind of at the receiving end of that, I can also recognize the kind of the common ground that there might actually be.
Sure. Yeah. So throughout the book, you have this term that you use, which when you first used it, I thought, that's an interesting term to use. And so you talk about how the church infects us. And I wonder if you can just, obviously this book was written out of the pandemic. And as I went along, I'm like, I like that you're using that term. I also like that it kind of makes me squirm a little bit. So can you talk about what you mean in terms of the church and the community infecting one another?
Yeah, well, I think it starts with biology rather than sort of any spiritual statements. Biologically, we are infected with one another. I mean, COVID made that like really clear, right? Because like at no point did we ever talk about stopping COVID. We talked about like flattening the curve. We talked about like slowing the spread, but we knew once those horses had left the barn that the fact that I'm breathing in the same water vapors and oxygen as the rest of the planet, and like my body is biologically set up to only be able to live because I'm taking in, earth, air, water, plants, fellow creatures from outside of myself into my own body. There is no way of not being infected, right? Like you can't be alive and not be infected with the world around you. Like that is just a basic biological premise of life in this universe. So that's kind of where I start with that concept. As far as the church goes, I'm convinced that perhaps the greatest offering that the church has to the world is reminding the world of our connectedness, reminding our world that we actually, like it or not, can't live without one another. I think that's the witness of our gathering, however that gathering is taking place, is that, like it or not, we have to figure out how to do this life together. So many of the planet's greatest crises, whether we're talking about environmental degradation and climate change, or whether we're talking about Black Lives Matter and efforts in anti-racism, or whether we're talking about mental health and suicide prevention. All of those crises kind of stem from trying to live as isolated individuals who don't have responsibility for or connection to the world and the people around us.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You write, and I highlighted it, so I have it here. You write, surely there is a connection between the church's steep decline and the coupling of our story of inadequacy with a story of how we do what only matters for ourselves. Kind of the sense of individualism that can that destroys community.
And again, that kind of goes back to where we started with so many of our efforts in addressing decline, not really taking us beyond that basic question of like, does any of this matter for anybody other than us?
Sure. Yeah. There's I always try to remind people that community is, and this is where I came to enjoy the term infected, right? Because there was a sense of, okay, you are a member of each other, right? One to another and all that. And, sitting beside each other in a pew, doing your own thing is not community, right? You're just being by yourself beside somebody else who is by themselves. Right. It is actually joining together in this robust and unique way that the church kind of lives and breathes and sings.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that as I say in the book, like we are stuck with one another. I might not always like that, but it's always true.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, one of the chapters in the book is called "We Are the Church." Martha, we are the church. Yeah. And it was kind of this conversation between me and a friend talking about all the things that we were frustrated with in the church and whether or not we should stay or fight for change. And my friend saying, like, Martha, we are the church, as in you can leave, I guess. But but you're not really like, you can't really walk away from that identity that's being imprinted on our soul. I guess it's sort of like the Hotel California. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave.
Absolutely. I once got an email that said, this is in a different parish that I was in. And the title of the email was "Worship Sucked Today." and it was all about how, this person didn't like the hymns that were chosen. And I remember responding, just saying, so what would happen if instead of thinking, oh, I hate this hymn, and so I'm not going to sing it, you recognize that, Bob loves this hymn.
Yeah.
And if you sing it with gusto, that's a blessing to Bob.
Yeah.
And how would that change how we enter into this messy, topsy-turvy, not always perfect world of the church that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that goes for us in leadership as well, because I think there is a real tendency in leadership to come into communities thinking that we know all the answers and that we kind of have to shoehorn that community into being the kind of church we want it to be. And I mean, leadership does matter and change is inevitable and needs to happen and all of those good things. But I think that we in leadership can have a much greater generosity of spirit as well, and recognize that what feeds me as a leader and what I most want to see as a leader in a church might be different from, what feeds my fellow Christians in the body of Christ.
Sure.
So, yeah, I think it works both ways for sure.
Absolutely. So the tagline of the book is the hope and promise of the church. So where are you most hopeful when you think about the future of the church? Where are you most hopeful?
I consider myself really fortunate to get to serve in a church with people who seem to be really, really good at sharing where God is at work in their lives. And that strengthens me immeasurably in my own walk with Jesus. It strengthens my relationship with God. So where am I most hopeful about the life of the church? It's those stories.
Sure.
Because that's the real stuff. That's the stuff that changes lives. That's the stuff that has a ripple effect. It isn't ever just one life who is being transformed or healed or blessed or loved. Like that always has a ripple effect into how other people then also see more clearly how God might be at work in their lives. And that happens to me all the time. Like I hope that in my leadership in the church, I help people to see God at work in their lives. But the reality is that the people of the church help me to see God at work in my life.
Yeah.
I find it difficult to, put a lot of expectation into where the whole institutional life of the church is going beyond that, beyond just seeing how alive we can be when we really tune into the frequency of
what Jesus is doing.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit briefly about my upcoming move to the territory of the people. And one of the things that I'm excited about, because the territory has a history of, kind of bankruptcy and all that stuff. And they were just a group of parishes. And so in some sense, all of the institutional stuff was just ripped away. And these parishes just had to figure out, okay, so how will we survive? What will it mean to be the church in this place in the best way that we can be? And so that's kind of defined this territory of the people, which is kind of going to be an interesting thing to kind of go into and to learn from them who have had to walk that journey in a very unique way.
Yeah.
Which I think the pandemic has shone a light for everybody to say, you know what, let's think about what it actually means to be the church and do the work of the kingdom and survive in a way which is not just about, maintaining the machine, right? Over and over.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I love that illustration that you just shared. I got to serve in an Anglican Lutheran church kind of just after they had merged together. And so there was a similar letting go of a lot of the assumptions of what the church would be, and like kind of an embrace of, okay, well, we're going to take the pieces of each tradition that best serve what we're trying to do here and now in this community. And, I'm not naive. I think the institution, I think the machine can do good things,
Absolutely.
but it has to be funneled toward supporting and equipping that. Like we have to
Sure.
start in the right place and then gear our resources
Absolutely.
toward that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and yes, absolutely. Because I think sometimes maybe, circling back to the, the seeing, accepting, and embracing, and the danger of turning our focus inward to make it all about us, right? I would say that danger is more heightened in as the more institutional you become, because it can become very easy for the institution to turn inward and then all of a sudden not see or accept or embrace what is truly the reality of what they're called to.
Yeah. And I think that inward looking is more often than not coupled with anxiety.
Sure.
And a very easy seduction is to lead from our anxieties.
Sure.
And I can name that as a leader as well. I'm sure you can too. Like, absolutely. I'm sure we can point to lots of times in our ministry where we let anxiety drive the bus.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and again, I think that's, this this validate and this repentance, as much as I might claim the messiness of something else, of the institution or others, I have to recognize that there is messiness within me as well.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can recognize that, then that allows us to move into this more holistic and uplifting culture of the church, which you are really articulating, right? Rather than, and you do have, and I like your 3-part: seeing, accepting, and embracing. And in some sense, there is that kind of, well, Anglicans, we love our 3-point, there is kind of that structure, but more broadly, you're talking about what does it mean to be the culture of the church?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And how do we live that out? And out of that culture will come these things.
Yeah. Out of that culture will come these things. Yeah. I think that's right. And, I think that, like as Christians, we have the great gift of a foundation that tells us that, it isn't all riding on our shoulders. And God does promise to meet us in the mess. And, there's just so much about that foundation, if we can establish it, that cultural foundation, that is not up to us to generate.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, so you've titled it "Why Gather," and you've probably got that question. I've for sure kind of coming out of the pandemic, although the pandemic was not over, but kind of coming into this new place. I'm sure everybody's had the question. It's all online. I love sitting on the couch with my coffee and just watching it. It's so much easier. How would you respond? Like, I know that the book is also the response, but if somebody is watching this now and has that question, Martha, why gather? Like, why wake up on Sunday morning and make my way down to the congregation? What would your response be?
Well, I guess, first of all, I would just want to say that online worship is still gathering, and I think that we've really had to make room for, like we had been live streaming our services for years before COVID hits, but we just never really thought about that online community as being anything other than at the periphery. And my colleague, Scott, always refused to refer to it as virtual worship because it's worship. Like it is worship and it is gathering. It's in a different way. That being said, certainly there are aspects of in-person worship that aren't replicated online. And a lot of those in-person aspects of worship have to do with being embodied in a particular space and time, and being really clear, because it's embodied, about who your neighbor is. And I don't just mean the person sitting beside you in the pew. I mean, the neighborhood where the church is located, sure, and the people that you're called to serve. So ultimately, whether we're talking about in-person gathering, online gathering, whether we're talking about kind of all of the hybrid ways that we know the church is going to go forward, why do we gather? I believe that we gather to bear witness to our connectedness as human beings on this planet. I believe that we bear witness, standing in opposition to that strident individualism that we know has been so destructive to human life and to life on this planet. And I think that we gather to lift up those stories of how God meets us in the infection and the binding and the ways in which we're stuck with each other.
Yeah, wonderful. One of the things you write is, I need the church in order to believe in Jesus, because it's only through the community of faith that Jesus' promise to be present to us is most faithfully enacted. Which is a bold statement in this kind of culture of individualism, to say, you know what, in terms of my faith, I need others. I need the church. I need people.
Yeah. And, I think Jesus was pretty good at modeling how he needed others in order to love and serve God.
Yeah. The only person who could legitimately say, I can do this myself, never did.
Right. That's good.
He completely involved other people. Martha, thank you for your time. If people want to reach out to you, how is the best way to contact you?
Well, I do have a website, marthatatarnic.ca. I am on Facebook and Instagram. You can just look up my name. I think I'm the only Martha Tartarnic on the planet. So if you put my name in a field, it's going to lead you to me. And I would love to hear from people, because I think the best thing about writing is when you get to start having the conversations with people.
Absolutely. Well, as I said, Martha, Why Gather is a wonderful book, and I highly recommend it. I just think it's great. And so I encourage everybody to read it. Martha, thank you very much for your time. I've so much enjoyed geeking out with you.
Thank you. The pleasure in geeking out has been mutual.
Wonderful. All right. Take care.
Thank you.